The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guest or host are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Hello and welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Hrkal. This show is all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. We are going to feature some very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to lead their best lives naturally. Hello and welcome back to Supplementing Health. My name is Dr. Paul Hrkal, your host, a naturopathic doctor and medical director for Advanced Orthomolecular Research. So this is part 2 of our magnesium piece that we're doing. In part 1, I covered all about what magnesium does in the body, what are some of the research supporting the benefits of magnesium, what are some of the signs and symptoms of magnesium deficiency, from anything from muscle cramps to high blood pressure to restless legs to chronic pain, really tense muscles, chronic headaches, and many others. We talked a little bit about testing magnesium in the body, and then we also talked a little bit about understanding why we're so deficient in magnesium. Now, that is such an incredibly important point to remember, is that there are so many things in our environment and what we're eating, what we're consuming, that are vying for the place of magnesium, and that has actually replaced magnesium in a lot of ways. A lot of medications, for example, anything that blocks stomach acid. You need stomach acid to effectively absorb all your minerals, and magnesium is one of the most important ones. And the biggest offender is going to be your proton pump inhibitors, those acid blocking medications. And unfortunately, that class of medications prescribed like Tic Tacs. It's prescribed so often. It's prescribed in infants and newborns. It's prescribed basically for anybody that has any sort of digestive issues. And I was just talking to a colleague this past weekend, and there's so many examples of, you know what, hey, you have nausea, let's give you a PPI. And on those PPIs, there's a label warning saying may cause magnesium deficiency, actually will cause, and it's not meant to be used long term. And unfortunately, they are. There are so many other things that are kind of leading to depleted magnesium, for example, in our soil, which translates into poor levels in our foods. So a lot of people that say, oh, I get all my magnesium from foods, that unfortunately is not something that I've seen get anywhere near what we need if we have any of the conditions that are related to magnesium deficiency. So the research shows that almost 50% of people are not getting the bare minimum, not the optimal, the bare minimum amount of magnesium. That's 50%. Now, if you add in chronic stress, you add in periods of poor eating, you add in periods of medication use, you add in periods of chronic pain, conditions that may require excess magnesium or more higher levels of magnesium, or you're an athlete. 90% of athletes are deficient in magnesium. So you can see how things really stack up to really we are a society of deficient people and really suboptimal people. An important point, as I should say, for suboptimal specifically, it's related to magnesium and your mineral levels. And your minerals are particularly at risk because of really it's hard to find them in foods that are bioavailable, and often those types of foods are not consumed as much anymore. So there's a lot of reasons why we're deficient, and that deficiency unfortunately, is not something you're going to find on some blood work. So you can't go to your doctor and say, you know what, hey, can you measure my magnesium levels? There are tests that you can measure magnesium, but they really become only out of range when a person has a pretty severe, either diarrhea, fluid loss, vomiting condition, because you're losing so much fluid and you're obviously losing electrolytes. And so those are people that are at risk for, electrolyte deficiencies, calcium, sodium, potassium, magnesium. But there is such a thing as suboptimal levels. And so that's something that blood work is not going to pick up. And just serum magnesium, which is magnesium in your bloodstream, is something that is tightly regulated. Your body regulates magnesium levels very tightly because it's an essential electrolyte, just like it regulates, potassium and sodium. So it's not something you can actually get tested very readily. There is this RBC magnesium, which is kind of intracellular, but that's often not run by doctors, and it may be a little bit more accurate of telling us what's inside, but I've run many of them. I've actually stopped running them in my practice because they all came back, in normal range. It might have been lower normal range, or it might be higher normal range, and usually it's higher after they've been taking magnesium, but I haven't really found that it's been diagnostic of anything, so I stopped running it. It really wasn't very clinically helpful. We have enough research to show that, in my opinion, we should all be taking magnesium, especially if any of the conditions or symptoms that we talked about. Other things that contribute to magnesium deficiency, just as a review, it's really important, which is why I'm going over it again. Any sort of intestinal surgery, so gastric bypass is one. Just working with a patient now where they had gastric bypass surgery, and we know it's well established in the conventional medical system as well in the research that people that have gastric bypass surgery can absorb many of their nutrients, both fat soluble and minerals as well. And so you actually have to take higher levels supplementing. And in my experience, I've rarely seen somebody that's had one of these surgeries and is actually able to absorb the nutrients. They're always massively, massively deficient, and often a lot of health concerns start coming up and popping up after they've had the surgery. Even though they may lose a large amount of weight, like over 100 pounds, then autoimmune diseases start happening, chronic malnutrition starts happening, etc. So, definitely it doesn't come without major risks, and most people don't follow the recommendations on actually supplementing after one of these surgeries. Think of any conditions with intestinal permeability or intestinal inflammation. So for example, celiac disease. And then there's that more gray area, non-celiac wheat sensitivity, which is still an allergic condition. It's a sensitivity. It's not an autoimmune condition like celiac, but that's affecting your lining of your gut. It's creating a more permeable or leaky membrane, and that is impairing your ability to absorb nutrients. When your gut lining, your enterocytes, the lining that's in the inside of your GI, it's one cell thick, starts becoming affected and inflamed, and the normal pathways and processes get impacted. They're not absorbing as well. And magnesium has two major ways of being absorbed, just kind of passive diffusion. It's a mineral. Whenever magnesium is supplemented, it gets broken apart by your stomach acid. We just talked about that. So let's say it's magnesium oxide that you're taking, or magnesium in a complex, an amino acid complex in food. We'll talk about food sources in just a second. It gets broken apart, and then it gets passively diffused. So that's small little minerals and ions can do that. But there's also another pathway, which is specific for absorption of your magnesium plus amino acid. So the amino acid kind of grabs the magnesium and pulls it through, but that is a much smaller percentage of absorption through that particular pathway. It requires more energy actually for it to do. So definitely passive diffusion by far is the most important, and it's the one that's most common. So you can see how there's lots of things that are competing for magnesium and are limiting its ability to be absorbed. We haven't even talked about things like antibiotics, for example. That was one of the major issues with some of the hardcore classes of antibiotics, like the fluoroquinolone class of antibiotics, so like the ciprofloxacin. And this class of antibiotics can bind magnesium directly. In fact, it says don't take with magnesium because the drug companies know that it grabs magnesium and doesn't let go. So that's one of the, right there, you can see you're going to be grabbing magnesium if somebody's on these antibiotics, especially long term. And not to mention the really detrimental impact that these antibiotics have on our microbiome, on our gut health. A lot of people actually will notice that that's a huge problem. So one of the theories is that when you become deficient in magnesium and deficient in some of these other minerals because of these antibiotics, this is over and above the effect on your microbiome. And microbiome probably has a definite role to play. But some experts feel that it's one of the reasons that some people, after taking this class of like fluoroquinolone, the floxin class of medication, Cipro class, they actually get what's called flux, and they are very difficult. It's very difficult for them to recover after this class of medication. And then people experience severe muscle fatigue, nerve pain, and often very debilitating symptoms. I worked with a couple of patients like this, and they're really treatment resistant. It's hard to treat with them or to address them. So we have a chronic low-grade magnesium deficiency. So how are we going to fix this? That's what everyone wants to know, obviously. We want to look at how we're going to fix this. So let's look at food. So obviously, as a naturopathic doctor, food is my main way of getting nutrients into people. And ultimately, that's the long-term strategy. It's the long-term play. And there are foods that are higher in magnesium, and it's a great idea to include them into your diet. Mostly you're probably eating some of them. So I try to break it down per serving here. So it's not, per bushel or per kind of like equal amount. So the serving wouldn't maybe change, but let's say an average serving. So for example, the highest level per serving of magnesium is 320 some odd milligrams in pumpkin or squash seeds. So this is something that's really popular now with, healthy fats, nuts and seeds. And it's something that is readily available. So eating a quarter cup of pumpkin seeds will give you 300 milligrams of magnesium. This doesn't mean this magnesium is readily absorbed. Most things in food may have an issue with absorption because you actually have to break them out of the fiber. You obviously have to break apart the outer kind of tougher shell. Everyone's tried a pumpkin seed. You have to break that down. If you're not chewing as well, you're not able to break some of that stuff down. If you don't have as much stomach acid, so you can see how, again, like with any absorption, we have to consider that you have to pull this out of your foods. So that's number one. And then it's actually number one by quite a bit. The next one on the list that I have is Brazil nuts. I try to take some Canadian values on this. So it's applicable for anybody in the world, but I try to grab some Canadian values because I'm Canadian. And then Brazil nuts is number 2 on the list, and they're about 130 milligrams per serving. And again, that's a quarter cup of Brazil nuts, which is quite a bit actually for Brazil nuts. I only recommend maybe 2 or 3 or 4, not more than that. Brazil nuts are high in something called selenium, which is an amazing mineral, very important for glutathione production. It is synergistic with magnesium in the production of glutathione. Magnesium is a key cofactor in the production of our master antioxidant called glutathione. It warrants us having a separate conversation about how important this antioxidant is. But you don't want to do this for 6 months straight, eating a quarter cup of Brazil nuts. So pumpkin seeds are your best bet. Then you get peas, but 120 milligrams, sunflower seeds at 120 milligrams, fermented soy like tempeh, 120 milligrams per serving. And then, really cereals on that list, almonds, soybeans, salmon. So cooked salmon, 2.5 ounces, you're getting about 92 milligrams. So not too much. Most supplements will give you anywhere from 100 to 200 milligrams. And we're going to talk about that now. Flax seeds are at about 78 in case somebody's wondering. Spinach at 83, that's cooked. Swiss chard at about 80. So really a lot of great healthy foods. I encourage everyone to incorporate these into their diet. But you're getting anywhere from 300 to maybe 100 milligrams of magnesium for any one of these foods. So as we talked about, there's some limitations with foods. Whether a person may be sensitive, you can't get them in all day. So I think magnesium is one of those minerals that get on my list of it's a daily supplement or a pretty regularly throughout the week, because it's so many things causing it to be deficient, as we've already pointed out at the beginning of the show. So let's break down all the different ways you can get magnesium through supplementation. There are many different types of magnesium. Probably one of the most diverse forms out of any natural health product. Like vitamin D is there's two forms. There's D3 and there's D2. D3 comes from lichen, or traditionally lanolin, which is sheep's wool, or the D2 comes from the cell wall of fungi, mushrooms. D3 is much better, in case you're wondering. So always stick with D3, vitamin D supplementation. And most of the good ones are now anyways. Look for an oil-based. So when it comes to magnesium, you have magnesium oxide, magnesium carbonate, chloride, hydroxide, magnesium citrate, gluconate, magnesium glycinate, magnesium malate, orotate, threonate, aspartate. All of these magnesiums have different characteristics. So I'm going to break them down into kind of three categories. There's the magnesium oxides, carbonates, chloride, hydroxide. These are kind of what's called the inorganic salts. And in general, the advantage of this group is that the magnesium is a small little mineral, and this other molecule it's attached to, like oxide, which means one oxygen is a small molecule. And you have very high very high ability to pack a ton of this one molecule, two atoms, magnesium plus oxygen, into a capsule. So you can easily get 500 milligrams of magnesium oxide into a tablet or into a supplement. The problem with this class, which is goes for oxide, carbonate, specifically those two, is that you have poor oral bioavailability. What does that mean? Basically, it means absorption. So getting that magnesium from your gut, what you put in your mouth, into your bloodstream where it's needed so it can be absorbed by your cells. That's the trade-off. So you get a ton of it. It's very inexpensive. You can find it at most pharmacies, and you'll usually find it in the laxative aisle, because it's like milk of magnesia, for example. That's magnesium hydroxide or magnesium oxide, because it has, a way of it's one of its functions that when you take it in high doses and high amounts, it will rush your digestive system with pulling water to itself. So it'll cause a person to go to the bathroom. So it's used acutely as a laxative. So effective for laxative, I don't think we need that form when we're looking at trying to get into the body. So then there is, I'll come back to mag chloride, because there are some companies touting kind of mag chloride in a solution as being more bioavailable. I mean, I've tried to look into it. I think that there's definitely something to it. In my kind of evidence-based world, I typically have found more research on the other forms of magnesium we're about to talk about, but just know that there are some liquid magnesium chlorides. Anything you put in a gel, like for example, anything topical, is a magnesium chloride. Some companies have kind of continued to perfect the application of that. Usually when you put like these magnesium chloride gels on, they feel salty because it's magnesium chloride, just like sodium chloride, which is salt. It's a type of salt, so it might be a little itchy for some people. And, I think that's improved with some of the deliveries, carrier creams that you put on. But, I personally don't use magnesium chloride in my practice. Maybe I should, but I get good results with the other forms that I'm going to use. Organic salt. So this is magnesium citrate, magnesium lactate, magnesium gluconate, magnesium sulfate. Magnesium sulfate are Epsom salts. So that is something that you pour in a bath and you can dissolve it, and it is absorbed through your skin. So we don't always have to get magnesium orally. Magnesium sulfate is a great way of getting it. Some people, you can find magnesium sulfate as Epsom salts in Costco. You can find it in any pharmacy. Typically there are some companies that have, touted, oh, we have a very clean source of magnesium salts, it doesn't know heavy metals. So just something to consider if you're looking for a really, really clean source. Whenever you're doing any sort of minerals coming from the ground, could there be other contaminants? Maybe. I'm not sure, but I've seen a couple of companies touting that they're heavy metal free. But magnesium sulfate's a great option. Magnesium citrate, tons of research on magnesium citrate as a form. So this class, this kind of category has good bioavailability. They're absorbed pretty well. But they have, again, higher doses can cause loose stools as well. They're missing the additional benefit of the last class of magnesium, which is magnesium chelates or magnesium complexes connected to an amino acid. So it's magnesium plus an amino acid. And you notice magnesium oxide is magnesium plus an oxide. And these are called inorganic salts. The magnesium citrate are called organic salts. And then the mag complexes are amino acids. And the additional benefit of the amino acids is that they have good absorption. The reason is that because it's connected to an amino acid, there's a specific pathway in the body that absorbs mineral complexes with amino acids directly. So you're not only just getting the passive diffusion, you're also getting the direct absorption. So that's really an additional benefit. Plus, you're getting the benefit of the actual amino acid. So for example, glycine, so magnesium glycinate. You're going to get the benefit of glycine, the amino acid. What's so good about glycine? Well, glycine actually is a very important amino acid for the function of your detoxification pathways. It also is majorly depleted by glyphosate, so Roundup. Roundup is one of these herbicides that is being used on crops. Like, for example, in Canada, unfortunately, it's been used in wheat. It's connected a lot with GMOs and Monsanto because Monsanto created it and they created the Roundup Ready plant. So they have these genes that basically prevent the plant from dying when it's sprayed with Roundup. So when you spray with Roundup, all the things around it die except this plant. The problem with Roundup, and as it relates to magnesium, specifically magnesium glycinate, is that what Roundup does is that it binds glycine, this amino acid, in the plant. And then when you consume the residues of Roundup, let's say, you ate a piece of bread that was made with regular wheat. Regular wheat is sprayed by Roundup to kill it at the end and to kind of speed up the harvesting process. And now it's starting to bind glycine in you. Glycine is important for, as I mentioned, detox, neurotransmitter function. Glycine is a very calming neurotransmitter. So magnesium glycinate, often it's used for calming purposes. So people will recommend it for sleep. They'll recommend it for tight muscles, anxiety. It's probably one of the most popular and commonly recommended magnesium supplements you'll find in the health food store. A quick point about the name of magnesium glycinate. Some brands or labels will say magnesium bis or BIS glycinate, magnesium bis glycinate. That's just a organic chemistry term for two molecules of glycine. So bis means two molecules. So it's actually magnesium in the middle and two glycine amino acids beside each other or beside the magnesium. And what this means is that there's these two big amino acid groups makes this molecule big. So the downside of this class of amino acid complexes is that they tend to be really big. And that means you can fit less of magnesium into a capsule. So if you wanted to, you could fit 500 milligrams of magnesium oxide into one capsule pretty easily. But you could only fit maybe 100 milligrams of magnesium glycinate into a capsule. So that's the biggest difference. So you're going to have to take a bit more. Some of you might be thinking, well, hold on, I take 150 milligram magnesium glycinate, or I take a 200 milligram magnesium glycinate. It's a perfect time for me to tell you a little bit about some of the trickery that occurs in the nutraceutical world. And it's not something I have to say I was terribly proud of when I found out about it. It was actually I was pretty upset. But it happens in any industry, and manufacturers, so the companies that supply the nutrients or herbs, in this case magnesium, to the company that you are buying it from. Many companies, many supplement companies are actually really just sales and marketing companies. They don't make their own products. Very few companies do. A lot of the big professional brands do. I know, for example, AOR has its own facility. It's in Calgary, but many other companies that you're probably using supplements from, they actually get these custom manufacturers to make their products for them. And so they buy these raw materials, this magnesium, and these suppliers, they started getting wise, and they said, hey, magnesium glycinate's one of the most popular products that everybody's buying. Why don't we find a way to make magnesium higher while still calling it magnesium glycinate? So what they did is they started mixing magnesium glycinate with magnesium oxide, and they started calling it magnesium glycinate chelate. So that's kind of a fancy word for magnesium glycinate mix. So a lot of people thought, oh, chelate, that nothing's wrong with that. If you have 100% chelate, which means pure magnesium glycinate, that's great. And many companies were touting that. But when they just started dropping the 100% and just saying chelate, a lot of companies just saying, oh, well, it must be good. So a lot of companies started selling 150 milligrams per capsule magnesium, 200 milligrams per capsule magnesium, and of magnesium glycinate. And people started buying it, and they thought, well, more is better, right? I have to take less. But what I started noticing in my patients is that my patients started coming in and they were getting loose stools after just maybe 2 capsules. And I'm like, one of the ways that I really saturate levels of magnesium inside a person's body is that we slowly increase the dose. And they were able to get to, 5, 10, capsules, usually without getting loose stools. And when I started noticing this, I started asking, like, what the heck's happening with this particular this particular type of magnesium. And so I started doing a little bit of investigation and realized that some of these other companies were using this chelate, and nothing's inherently wrong with that. There's still, magnesium glycinate present. It's not harming the patient. You're just basically getting magnesium oxide when you thought you were getting magnesium glycinate. Now, from a therapeutic perspective, we could argue, what the problem with that is. I want more magnesium glycinate. I want the full therapeutic dose. And the big kicker is that many of these companies, when this started getting to be an issue, is that they weren't reporting the magnesium oxide. So now, unfortunately, they many of them got wise and smart. They had to, because people were getting upset. Because there was actually 2 lawsuits in the U.S. for exactly this. They're saying, well, you're actually misadvertising, you're misrepresenting your magnesium formulation. There is, in a 200 milligram magnesium we're just talking the magnesium, 200 milligrams, you're roughly getting 68% of your magnesium from magnesium oxide. That means only like 30%, 30% of it's coming from magnesium glycinate. That's not what people are buying, right? So anyways, just a word to the wise. More with magnesium per capsule is not necessarily better. It's something that you should consider. So use magnesium glycinate. That is, I would say roughly about 100 milligrams per capsule is going to get you pretty close to pure magnesium glycinate. Okay, let's move on to some of these other forms. Magnesium malate is another one of my favorite forms. It is malic acids found in apples. It gives you that nice tart flavor. Malic acid is part of something that is happening inside of each one of our cells called the citric acid cycle, basically the energy production cycle. It's actually happening inside our mitochondria. So many clinicians will use this form of magnesium for the production of energy, and it's been studied for muscle pain. So fibromyalgia is the big one that a lot of people are using this for. It's a very popular form. With fibromyalgia, the research shows that their cells are deficient or lower levels of ATP, or energy precursor. So malic acid kind of helps promote the function of this citric acid cycle. There's magnesium citrate, which we talked about. It's been used for headaches. It's been used for, just replacing deficiency. So magnesium citrate's a good form. It's not an amino acid form, so I would point that out. So you're going to get the additional benefits of magnesium glycinate and malate. But citric acid and citrate, there is some benefits of taking that. It's not an amino acid. A couple other ones that I wanted to point out here. Magnesium ortate. Magnesium ortate is probably a form you've never heard of before, because most of the research actually comes from old Eastern Europe, actually communist Eastern Europe. And so, like Russia, Ukraine. And they were looking at a type of magnesium that was able to repair heart tissue. And if you're looking at the amount of research on different types of magnesium, most people would actually be quite surprised that there's very little research, published research on magnesium malate or magnesium glycinate. It's pretty funny because it's the two most common forms that you're finding in retail stores. Magnesium ortate has much more research behind it. So ortic acid is a specific amino acid that helps pull magnesium into the bloodstream, but also into the heart specifically. And ortates or ortic acid helps the repair of your DNA. And they were specifically using it for heart failure, high blood pressure, symptoms of heart pain, so angina, arrhythmias, exercise performance. So I use this specifically in those conditions. I have to be honest, I still probably use magnesium glycinate and malate. There's a lot of mechanistic and kind of reasonable benefits why you'd want to use this one, why you want to use those two forms. Magnesium ortate is a little bit more expensive. But if somebody has a heart condition and they need to repair their heart, magnesium ortate. Magnesium taurine is another one that I mentioned in the last episode, and magnesium is really well paired with taurine. Taurine's an amino acid that has multiple benefits like glycine. It helps with detoxification. It helps improve your insulin signaling, so your blood sugar regulation. It also has a calming effect. It is called the master osmolyte. And what does that mean? That means that taurine has this ability to keep the electrolytes in the right areas. So magnesium and potassium are intra, meaning inside the cell electrolytes, where something like calcium and sodium are inter, so they're between cells, they're outside the cells. So magnesium taurate normalizes these electrolytes, which normalizes electrical activity across membranes. So think like heart conduction, think brain conduction, think nerve conduction, bile secretion and detoxification. So the additional benefit of taurine, I'm a huge fan of combining magnesium and taurine. I might do them actually separately. And there's a number of formulas that have magnesium and taurine in it together. Magnesium and taurine are not well reacted together, meaning like there's not a pure chelate, so they're not actually combined as a molecule. So usually the taurine's added as an amino acid, it's stable by itself, and then magnesium citrate is added, and that's what you might find in a formulation, because it's hard to find a pure magnesium taurine chelate, and that's more of just like on the practical side. So that's a little bit about the forms of magnesium. I forgot, magnesium threonate. I got to mention that. Magnesium threonate is the new kid on the block in terms of the forms. It has research showing that it can get across the blood-brain barrier and get into the CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, better than other forms. And specifically, there was research, I believe it was at Stanford, and one other kind of prestigious U.S. institution, and they were finding that it was getting into the brain and it was increasing nerve transmission, and nerve growth. So that was pretty neat. We know magnesium has a lot of benefits on brain health, lowers inflammation. So think of, Alzheimer's, brain injuries, multiple sclerosis. So if you're really intent on getting magnesium into the brain, that's where you really need it. There is research supporting the benefit of magnesium threonate. It is probably the most expensive form of magnesium. Like orotate, it's very specific, but you're getting that specific benefit. Okay, so that gives you a pretty good idea of all the different forms of magnesium, some of the pros and cons to each one. Some of the amino acids we just talked about, we have the additional benefit of those amino acids. So I want to finish off by talking a little bit about some of the most commonly asked questions about magnesium. So you're probably thinking about some of these questions as you're listening, and just some of the key, some of the key takeaways as we were talking about the different forms. How much magnesium should I take is a really common one. And I mentioned a little bit just a couple minutes ago that one of the ways of actually getting your magnesium dose is that you kind of increase your levels slowly. Maybe every couple days you add an extra capsule. And this is I always recommend with, the guidance of a healthcare practitioner. We always say, don't start a supplement before knowing, your basic things like blood pressure and some blood work. But magnesium is very safe. And so it's one of the ones that people probably would be the safest without getting a full workup. But if you're going to increase it slowly and get up to high doses, that's when you should have somebody monitoring you. So that's how you get to your right dose. And then, normally people as a maintenance dose, usually around 400 milligrams. You break that up throughout the day. If you take one massive dose of magnesium, you're going to get maybe 20% of it absorbed. So the more doesn't necessarily mean better absorption. It actually, in many cases with natural health products, is that you actually get less absorption because there's kind of like a diminishing returns point. You kind of saturate the pathways in the gut, and it actually starts competing against itself. Magnesium is one of those things that you should be taking alone. Empty stomach probably would be the best because it's the highest stomach acid, and you're not competing with any amino acids. If you think that there's enough magnesium in your multi, you're probably it's probably not, because magnesium is with all those other things. And so you've just massively decreased the absorption of all these other nutrients because, again, they're competing. So, for example, magnesium competes with zinc and it competes with other minerals for absorption. So that's not to say that mineral complexes are not effective. It just means that you are probably going to have to take a little bit more. Okay, so that's the dose piece. How long do you have to take it for? Well, I kind of mentioned this a little bit, I alluded to it before. Only 1% of your magnesium is in your bloodstream, which is one of the reasons that blood testing is really inaccurate. Over 50% of it's stored in your bone. So a lot of people think calcium for bone health, magnesium is just as important. And oftentimes the reason that a person's impacted by poor bone health is because they fall, they have poor muscle function that regulates their ability to walk and their strength. And that is actually the real issue with brittle bones. So magnesium and calcium are very important together, not just calcium for bone health, but magnesium is stored in bone. And so that means that it's the reservoir in bone. So if you're eating a really poor diet, like there was a period in your life that it was, just fast food, and you were eating a lot of refined foods, so refined carbs and meats, and these pro-inflammatory foods, the body usually becomes acidic with those particular foods. And that means that it actually pulls alkaline minerals, and magnesium and calcium and potassium. These are alkaline minerals stored in the bone. So bone is not just for structure. It's actually as a dynamic tissue, which there's exchange of minerals. It's constantly being remodeled. It's producing our red blood cells in our bone marrow, which is in the middle of our bone. So if we understand magnesium, 50% of it's in the bone, it takes a while for those levels to be built back up. So I always recommend at least 6 months of consistent supplementation if you want to build your levels back up. Safety of magnesium, I also alluded to this as well. Magnesium, like vitamin C, If you take too much, you get loose stools. So that's a kind of a built-in safety valve. So there are rare cases of people taking magnesium and causing issues, and they have to be hospitalized with, heart function. So there's usually some sort of underlying issue that might be, or there's some kind of absorption pathway that's either being blocked, or elimination pathway that's blocked. So, it's overall very, very safe. Very, very safe. People don't usually absorb any sort of, people don't, and they don't absorb anything that they don't need. We talked about synergistic nutrients. B6 helps pull magnesium into the cell. So we talked about taurine. Taurine is like complementary to magnesium, a lot of similar functions. It regulates electrolytes, including magnesium. When B6 is low, both magnesium and taurine become further deficient, and B6 is another massive issue with the deficiency. One of the biggest things that depletes B6 is actually the birth control pill. Depletes B6 in the B vitamin class. So again, you can just start seeing how just so many things conspiring to really make magnesium massively deficient. There is a connection between vitamin D and magnesium. Vitamin D, obviously, how important it is. It's converted from cholesterol when sun hits cholesterol under the skin. And that's converted to a more active form called 25-OH hydroxy vitamin D. And then for these conversions, you need magnesium. So if you're deficient in vitamin D, you may actually be deficient in magnesium because you're not able to convert it. So it goes hand in hand. Not to mention, we just talked about how important vitamin D, magnesium is for bones. So obviously we know vitamin D is for magnesium. So those are some of the most common questions that people ask. And hopefully this was really helpful for you to understand some of the differences between the forms, some food sources, a quick review of all the reasons that we're deficient. I think the takeaway is this is one that probably you need to add to your regime if it's not already. It's important for so many different things: energy production, heart function, nerve function, chronic pain prevention. And if you have any health issues, magnesium would be one of the ones that would be top of the list. So if you're giving it to kids, if you're pregnant, obviously talk to your healthcare provider and practitioner about that, and that will, again, make sure that you're covering all your bases. But overall, this is very, very safe. So I had a lot of fun today. Magnesium, as you can probably tell, is my jam. I use it a lot with my patients. I have, 5-6 different forms in my clinic, and I use them all. They all have different therapeutic actions. So thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Supplementing Health. Hopefully you will join me next time, and we'll talk about another key health issue. Until next time, take care. Be well. Thank you for listening today. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcasts. Do you have a topic that you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic, or email us at marketing@aor.ca. We hope you tune in again next week to learn more about supplementing your health.